Welcome to Mass Culture's MC Minds, where we delve deeper into the intelligence of Canadian thought leaders in the arts. My name is Catherine Khiersema. Today, live performance media performer, producer, creator and activist Sedina Fiati interviews Simon Brault, Director and CEO of the Canada Council for the Arts. They discuss cultural diplomacy as inspired by Mass Culture's digital gathering that took place on November 7th, 2019.
Hello, Simon. My name is Sedina. I'm a Toronto-based artist and arts manager and activist. I've been at the game for 20-ish years. Let's give it that. It's like, when does one start becoming an artist? I don't know. It's very sort of existential.
Very
question.
early,
so, yeah.
probably.
Yeah, it's true. Do you count from childhood? Do you count from high school? I'm excited to chat with you today about cultural diplomacy. So I'll just launch right into the questions that we've come up with. First question about cultural diplomacy, which I hope will frame this whole interview. So we talk about cultural diplomacy. We're actually thinking of, I think, a combination of touring, building relationships, marketing, delegations. I find the term inaccessible and distancing from what it's supposed to represent. The word diplomacy has very governmental connotations and conjures up governmental relationships. And I think the word really means artist-to-artist relationships across country. What are some approaches that will help the concept be more accessible?
It's an excellent question. Actually, I think that I need to clarify what we mean at Canada Council by cultural diplomacy. I think it's really, any given year, for instance, the Canada Council for the Arts is supporting close to 2,000 projects in 100 countries that are submitted by the artists. And the artists are kind of following their own path, their own desire, their own aspirations to show their work and to share their work. And one can argue that any exhibition, tour, concert, reading, co-production happening outside of Canada involving Canadian artists, in fact, is contributing in some way to cultural diplomacy with a very broad definition of what cultural diplomacy means. When we talk about cultural diplomacy right now at the Canada Council, we're not referring to those activities. What we are referring to is really the fact that our country is contemplating right now the possibility of reinstating a real framework for cultural diplomacy. So the intention of the Canada Council is not and will not be to consider that everything we do on the international stage is cultural diplomacy. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. But what we are saying is that if Canada as a country wants to practice cultural diplomacy, so wants to insert in all its tools of diplomacy, culture, arts and culture, then it should be well defined. And we think that the council and the artists have a role to play into it. One of the very big confusion where I'm seeing right now is that some people are arguing that everything is cultural diplomacy. And in a sense, it's not untrue. But what I'm saying is that any country who wants to establish relationships with other countries needs to practice diplomacy. And in the context of diplomacy, so it's really something led by diplomats and by government, there is room for arts and culture. And it has been more or less abandoned by Canada for many, many years. For many years, cultural diplomacy was something that was happening almost by accident or because, artists wanted to do it, but it was not something valued by the Canadian government. And in many of our missions and embassies in the world, there was not even one person working with the task of achieving cultural diplomacy initiatives. So we are at this very moment right now in Canada where it seems that the government is interested to bring back something more robust in terms of cultural diplomacy. And in that context, I believe that we need to define what it means, and I think we also even discussed the question of a renewed approach, of a more fair and more equitable approach to cultural diplomacy than what I can see in many other countries in the world. But for Canada Council, for instance, we, for the moment, consider that when we are involved in cultural diplomacy operations, we need to be very clear about what it is, what it entails, what is the moral contract between the diplomats, the Canada Council, and the artists. And it's different from, supporting and funding any exhibitions or any tour or any concert or any co-production in the world. We fund those activities by artists in the world, not with the aim of promoting cultural diplomacy. We fund those activities because we believe that the artists need to share their work with the rest of the world. And by doing so, sometimes it creates moment for cultural diplomacy, but a lot of the time it has nothing to do with formal cultural diplomacy.
This is not a question that I put forth, but I'm curious about, could you give me some examples of what cultural diplomacy looks like in terms of, you talked about that Canada hasn't really had a robust policy about this for a long time. Have there been any examples in the past?
In the past, so I would say 15 years in the past, Global Affairs or External Affairs Canada, they had a small department, and they were in fact on a regular basis making calls for artists to apply to present exhibitions or tours and all of that. And they had a list of countries that were considered by External Affairs as being priorities. So they would get the applications, they would make a selection according to their diplomatic needs, and they would fund directly the artists. And that disappeared during the Harper government. That has been completely cut. And in fact, there was no official channel for cultural diplomacy for many, many different years. There were people in some embassies doing this work, and Canada Council was involved, and we would support the presence of Canadian artists and all that, but all that was through our regular programs. I will give you a recent example of what cultural diplomacy means for us. 2 years ago, there was a possibility in Mexico. In Guanajuato, there's a huge festival called Cervantino, and that festival features a guest country at every edition. Canada has been a featured guest country years ago, I think in 2012. And in 2012, it was really a discussion between the festival and the Ministry of External Affairs. And the Ministry of External Affairs made an appeal and selected the artists to be presented in that festival. What has been presented at that time was very, I would say, mainstream. So, the symphony and very classical work. 2 years ago, we had a discussion with the festival. And when I say we, it was the Canada Council. So they kind of asked Canada Council, are you interested to support the presence of Canada as a guest of honor for the Cervantino Festival? And my answer was, yes, we are interested. But we will, if we are interested, as the Canada Council, we want to make sure that what will be presented in the festival will reflect the diversity of the artistic creation in Canada in terms of genre, in terms of aesthetics, in terms of regional representations, in terms of diversity, indigenous presence, and all of that. So we kind of engaged a discussion with the festival from the perspective, not the perspective of a diplomat or the perspective of diplomacy. We engaged a conversation on the perspective of showing the truth and the reality of the artistic scene and the complexity and the diversity of the artistic scene in Canada. But what I did with my staff is we phoned External Affairs, Global Affairs, and we said, oh, this is a big festival. They knew it. This is the 70th anniversary of diplomatic relationships between Canada and Mexico. Are you interested? Is Canada interested as a country to do something more for Cervantino this year and really build a momentum for cultural diplomacy? And the answer was, yes, we are interested. So what happened is that the federal government, the external affairs, they invested money. They created, they opened a Casa Canada in the festival, and they really organized and supported a lot of activities where artists were invited to present, to participate in panels and all of that. And those discussions were more about advancing discussions and about the values of Canada and the reality of Canada. So what we did finally, by combining our interest to show the work of the artists and the interest and resources of the Canadian government to advance cultural diplomacy, we succeeded to really scale up the presence of the artists in Cervantino. These situations are happening more and more. You know, next week I'm leaving for Africa, for La Côte d'Ivoire, because it's the biggest market for the performing arts for Africa. And I wanted to give another example. There is next week, actually, in March, the edition of the MASA. The MASA is the market for performing arts for Africa. And again, Canada is the featured country this year. Canada Council, we have been approached by the festival. And again, the proposal was, would you support the presence of artists and artistic companies in our festival? And finally, we will support close to 100 artists and cultural workers and coming from everywhere in Canada in Côte d'Ivoire next week. And again, in this case, it was not only a transaction in terms of Canada Council supporting artists to be present in the festival, but there's also a dimension that is really related to what we call cultural diplomacy. We have been involving diplomats, our embassy there, the Department of Global Affairs, and even Canadian Heritage. So really, there's a presence of the government because the government has a vested interest to be more present and visible in Africa, and was willing to support and to really stage activities that would promote, in fact, the diplomatic efforts of our country. So I think it's really kind of important to make that distinction between anything that is international outreach of Canadian artists, which is one of the core business of the Canada Council, and cultural diplomacy, which is really the idea of using or counting or tabling on the convening power of arts and culture to provoke discussions, meetings that are about topics that are larger than just the arts and culture, because cultural diplomacy is really this idea that you can organize and you can set discussions and conversations that otherwise would be difficult to have if there was not the pretext of an exhibition or of a presentation or a show to provoke and organize the discussion and the conversation on different topics that, you know, even politicians or diplomats would not explore themselves by themselves. So I want to make that distinction between what is cultural diplomacy as an activity, as a government activity in its relationship with other countries, and the presence of artists all over the world who are in fact playing a certain role to represent Canada, but not with that intention specifically. Everything as cultural diplomacy, we are kind of, in fact, abandoning this idea that cultural diplomacy could be one of the aspects of Canadian diplomacy in the world. I think that as a country, we should have a real cultural diplomacy framework, and we also need to make sure that the artists are presented and supported to be on the world stage without having the obligation or the duty or the burden of playing the role of being diplomats or ambassadors of Canadian values. Otherwise, my fear would be that we would instrumentalize the arts. I think that when it's cultural diplomacy, we need to make sure that the artists understand exactly, what is the context. We need to make sure that the diplomat who are organizing the activity respect the freedom of speech and don't see the artist as responsible to show the perfect image of our country. So I think discussing cultural diplomacy means that you need to address some ethical questions. You need to make sure that we have clarity about, what is happening exactly, which is very different from organizing a tour of a band or the presentation of a theater show in Edinburgh or an exhibition in I don't know, in Venice or anywhere in the world.
I have a couple of follow-up questions to that. You said that there isn't a framework at the government at the moment, and it sounds like the Canada Council is leading whatever activities are actually happening. Are you pushing for Canada Council to continue doing that work, or are you asking the government to go back to taking on the work of leading these types of delegations?
What I'm saying is that there is, at this very moment, there is some cultural diplomatic activity happening all over the world. They are happening because our embassies, some of our ambassadors are doing it and all of that, but it's happening I would say on some kind of it's a case by case. So sometimes the Canada Council is involved, sometimes we are not involved, sometimes it's about cinema and telefilm is involved. A lot of people are involved in that business. Because Canada now, especially after the report that came out of the Senate, is considering the possibility of reinstating a formal cultural diplomacy approach that will be led by the government and most specifically by global affairs. What we are saying at Canada Council is that this is good. This is good because it's kind of a new channel, an additional channel that the artists and artistic companies across Canada can take advantage of to be more present on the international stage. But what we are saying is that if we want to have a robust, sustained, and fair cultural diplomacy, we think that our organizations like the Canada Council have a role to play. We have a role to play because we can easily bridge the artists, because we are constantly in contact with them, because we support creation and production and presentation and all of that. We can bridge the artists with the diplomats. I mean, cultural diplomacy has to be led by the diplomats. That's their business. But obviously, if they need artists, they need content and all of that. We at Canada Council are willing to play that role of co-curating, if you want, with the diplomats to make sure that the artists will be presented and also will be respected, to make sure that there will be diversity, to make sure that there's no not direct political interference in the selection of the artists. So we believe, I profoundly believe that an arm's length agency can play a very positive role for a country like Canada in terms of selecting and curating what is presented or what is proposed in different situations. That being said, I don't think that cultural diplomacy will become, the biggest part of what we do on the international stage. I think the very core of what the Canada Council needs to do is to support the artists because they apply to our regular programs and they are following their own paths to be present on the international stage. Sometimes some artists will play a role in cultural diplomacy. Other artists refuse to do so, and it needs to be respected. But I think that cultural diplomacy is something important for a country like Canada, and if we want to do it in involving an arm's length agency like the Canada Council, who has distance with the government in terms of the selection of the artists, but who has ongoing relationships with artists and artistic organizations in Canada, would be something very positive. But that's not for us to decide. That's for the government to decide, obviously.
I have a follow-up question to that, but I will put a pin in it and get back to it because I think it's important to talk about. So in terms of cultural diplomacy, looking at inviting artists to this land, those of us who are non-Indigenous to this land that we call Canada, we grapple with what rights relations looks like with the many Indigenous nations. What frameworks can the Canada Council provide to build relationships with Indigenous and non-Indigenous artists to address this very question?
I think, again, it's an excellent question. I think I believe that the fundamental role of the Canada Council is really to support the artists, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, the artists to show their work, present their work without any constraint and any specific contextualization the way they want to do it. And when we get applications, again, I said last year we supported 1,700 projects, all over the world. Those projects were absolutely articulated by the artists, and it was really for the artists to kind of really do their own work and go where they think is important for them to be, or are responding to invitations they got from presenters from all over the world. But obviously, when, there is, if Canada decides, Canada is the guest of honor, for instance, of the Frankfurt Book Fair in 2020, so next October, and because Canada is a guest of honor, there was an understanding that there would be a full year of cultural programming in Germany, supported by Canada and supported by funds that are coming from cultural diplomacy, not from the Canada Council. And what we did, Canada Council, to make sure that Canada would be fairly represented is we made a public call, and we had asked artists who had a possibility of presenting their work in Germany during that year to apply, and there was a selection process involving the embassy in Berlin and the Canada Council staff. And our preoccupation at Canada Council was constantly to make sure that the work that would be presented would reflect the diversity and of the artistic production in Canada. So I think I would not like to have a situation where any artist supported to travel around the world is supported because they serve Canadian cultural diplomacy. I think it would be totally wrong. I think we need to make sure that the Canadian artists have access to the world stage on their own terms. But I think that for the artists that are willing to participate in cultural diplomatic initiatives led by the government, they need to understand what the terms of the engagements are. And we at Canada Council will really argue and advocate to make sure that the artists will be respected if they want to be part of it, that they will be treated fairly, paid fairly, and that they will have complete freedom of speech. And we also will do the work we can do to make sure that the diplomats at the highest level and at the local level respect that and honor that. So it's really kind of an ongoing discussion. And again, I think that not confusing the notion of cultural diplomacy and the notion of accessing the world stage is really important. Otherwise, there is a risk. There will always be a risk that, presenting artists on the world stage would become some form of propaganda. And I don't think that's the role of the Canada Council for the Arts.
For sure. I think I more meant, can cultural diplomacy play a role within Canada to foster relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous artists?
I think it's a very interesting idea. I believe that if we talk about nation to nation, and we should talk about relationship from nation to nation, I think the government should consider diplomacy and should consider cultural diplomacy as a way to advance those relationships. And I think, and again, that's a decision for the government. It's not the responsibility of the artist to make it happen. I understand that diplomacy is really a tool that is used and that is at the disposal of states and of nations or cities, and all of that is something, it's an activity they can conduct to resolve conflicts, to avoid conflicts, diplomacy is the way of maintaining relationships even in difficult and challenging conditions. Diplomacy becomes even more important when the relationship with another nation is mortgaged or challenged or difficult, because you can do with diplomacy things that you will never achieve with force or with police or with war. So I'm a believer of the importance of diplomacy, and what I'm arguing for on the international stage, and what you're suggesting that it could be applied domestically, I support that. I think it's a very good idea.
Okay.
But we are still far from it.
Yes, we are. And I wonder how the Canada Council, even with the types, because that is one way Canada Council can foster these relationships, is what programs or frameworks that can be put forth in the existing programs that would continue that diplomacy within Canada itself.
I think it's something we need to explore. Again, I want to make sure that it needs to be something, I think we should support that. I don't think it should be the essential mission of the council, because again, diplomacy, when you practice diplomacy, you want to achieve something that is beyond and over only the sharing of arts and culture. It's you have other goals. By definition, diplomacy is trying to attain different goals that are sometimes political, that are commercial, that are military, that are. You try to achieve something through exchanges that we call diplomatic exchanges, including culture and art. So I think it's kind of, again, it's an instrument that is very useful for nations and for states. I agree with that. Canada Council is not an organization doing diplomacy, but I think that the minute that is happening, it is wise from the government perspective to kind of require the expertise of an organization like the Canada Council, because we can make, again, the bridge between the artists and between the diplomats or the government. We will have an experience that I think looks like a little bit like internal and external cultural diplomacy, because the Canada Council will be involved in supporting and playing some kind of a leadership role in an art summit that will happen in the north. It's called the Arctic Arts Summit. It is in a year and a half, more or less, in 2022. And this is very interesting because Canada Council is involved. And what we want is we want to make sure that, first of all, this art summit will happen in the north, for the north, that the voices from the north and mainly the indigenous voices, and so First Nation Inuit voices, will be heard and will be prominent in that activity. So in a sense, that summit will become something that is achieving both international diplomacy, because all the countries with Nordic territories will be involved, but also, I hope, will achieve some kind of a sophisticated domestic diplomacy. But again, that's the spirit in which we work at Canada Council. But in order to make it a real activity with real diplomacy and all of that, we need to convince the government, the Canadian government, to do it and to act and to conduct it with the idea that they want to achieve diplomatic goals with other countries and within Canada. And I believe that diplomacy is important, even if, again, Canada Council is not that's not our main role. I think we can play a role and we should play a role. And I hear more and more artists from all over Canada asking us to play that role, and we're willing to do it.
Thank you. I have questions about the curatorial principles by which you are choosing artists to participate in the delegations. For instance, the one in Massa, I thought that was really. When it showed up in my inbox, I was just like, "Oh, this is interesting," because my father is from Ghana. My mom is from Trinidad, but and I don't think I'd seen anything quite like that before. I'm sure maybe it existed, I just hadn't seen it. But my first thought was, who are they sending to this, and why? And so I wonder. I think you've spoken about the why in very clear terms, but what are the curatorial principles? Like, how are you choosing people? And I suppose I'm asking because I as a person of African descent, directly, I'm kind of like, oh dear, like, am I going to be, if I were to go and see the artists that were there, would I feel like they were representing Canada? Would I feel like there was predominantly white artists? Is it furthering an image of Canada that is, as you've spoken about, that is diverse, that is complicated? So I'm curious about that.
Every situation is different. The situation with Massa, the way it was working is that the festival itself, so Massa, was doing a selection of the artists. So they made, with the Canada Council, a big appeal to artists in Canada. And they had an international jury deciding, which company would be invited by Massa. So that was kind of the first round. And we realized, when we saw their choices, we realized that there were more possibilities and that we could have something, for instance, Massa is happening in Côte d'Ivoire. It's very Francophone. So their knowledge of the Black Anglophone artists is minimal. I mean, it's not at the level of the French one. So what we came back at Canada Council, we again did another public call in order to have more proposals from more artists, and we supported some of them. So at the end of the day, most of the artists who are going to that specific festival are from African descent. I mean, they are from the diaspora, mainly from all over Canada. So Francophone, Anglophone, every region. Mostly it's performing arts, so circus, storytellers, singers, musicians, and all of that. And we're very proud of that because we realized that the fact that we could make it happen and we could partner with Massa was a way to reach more artists than before. Because before, most of the Canadian artists would attend the Massa would be from Quebec because the connection to Frank. And we thought that this time it was an occasion as the national funder of the arts in Canada to kind of broaden that perspective. And same thing actually happened when we did the festival in Mexico, because there's a lot of very strong relationships between Mexico and Quebec, but not so much with artists across the country. So again, we played that role to make sure that we would signal. And that's kind of a part of what I call curatorial role, that we will signal to our partners in Mexico blind spots. They had no knowledge of, for instance, of indigenous artists really. And we had a very strong delegation, like when we were in Mexico, including a lot of the artists for diversity, a lot of indigenous artists, a lot of, and even the first show, the opening of the festival with Lydia Pimento and A Tribe Called Red was something very different than what has been ever presented about Canada there. And again, the desire there was not diplomatic, the desire was artistic. But when we saw that it was possible to make it happen, then we talked to the federal government, to the government, and said, this is a moment where Canada can achieve a lot in terms of diplomacy, because this is what will be presented of Canada is a real reflection of what Canada is today. And it's not like the predictable programming that people always see about Canada. It's something really different. And we think it's a moment to build genuine and more profound relationships between our two countries. So I believe artists are more and more interested on being on the international stage. I can see that at Council. I hope that in the next years that more and more Canadian artists will be willing to go on the international stage. And I'm saying that the main road to do it is not cultural diplomacy. The main road to do it is really the funding coming from Canada Council and other partners to be present on the international stage. But I think that cultural diplomacy is another road, and that road is important, and we should take care of it. And as Canada Council, we want to make sure that it is something that is more promising, more interesting, and more sustaining from the point of view of the artists. So it's really kind of a combining our mainstream mission with this kind of a addition of cultural diplomacy in a more structured way than what we saw over the last 10 years. I don't want to replace everything by cultural diplomacy.
Oh, no, I get you. I have two questions. So I'll ask the one that's on my mind in response to what you were just talking about. So can you talk a little bit about the outreach strategies for these cultural delegations? And I'm speaking from the point of view is that I barely know that they haven't. So how is Canada Council going to increase their outreach in terms of even reporting back, in terms of social media strategies, so that artists are aware that these activities are happening? Because I think a big problem, like even me asking my artist friends, of which I have many, just even the word cultural diplomacy, they're kind of like, what's that? And for instance, talking about the different delegations, most people don't even know that they're happening. Or in the case of artists of color, a lot of us wouldn't even feel like we would be able to do something like that. But it sounds like there's good work happening. So how is Canada Council going to report on these activities that are happening in ways that is accessible?
Excellent question. In fact, when those delegations are happening, that are really delegations of cultural diplomacy or commercial, delegations and all of that, at Canada Council, we're not always associated with everything. What we do is we kind of always make a decision. Is this project or this delegation, is it serving both our fundamental purpose at Canada Council, which is to showcase and present, artists worldwide and the diversity of artistic creation? So is it achieving that? And if it is achieving that, are we supporting, also the goal of the delegation? Because we sometimes, we are an arm's length agency, and sometimes, there's a delegation there. It's interesting. We're not against it, but we don't think as Canada Council that we should be involved. But when we are involved, what we do more and more is we try, through social media, through the website and all of that, really to advertise it and to make sure that people hear about that. And I think what I can see is that obviously we have some success because we are overwhelmed by asks, both on our regular programs and on special initiatives. And I think we want to create, we started, 5 years ago when we announced that we would double our investment on international, I thought it would take 5 years. It took less than a year because so many artists want to travel, co-produce and all that. There's a huge demand for that in Canada. So what we need to do is to make sure that we sustain that presence on the world stage, and that we really kind of maintain, and every time we do something, that we talk about it, and that artists are aware of that. Sometimes it's happening very quickly, like for instance the Cervantino Festival in Mexico that I talked, we had 6 months to do it. The Massa, we had more than a year. So sometimes, we know way in advance that something is coming, and we have plenty of time to talk about it, and sometimes it's happening very quickly. It depends on the situation. But I think that our responsibility at Canada Council is to make sure that we communicate in a proactive way with the artists directly, through their associations, through the NASOs across Canada, and PCH and Global Affairs, the government does it too. Sometimes, again, we are involved. Sometimes we are not involved. But when we are involved, we make a point to communicate and to let people know that it's happening. And I think the more we will do it, the more we will sustain that presence, the more there will be artists in all the provinces and communities and territories who will have the experience and will be able to talk to others and create some kind of a community of support. Because there's something, when you want to go on the international stage, they are, you need to be prepared. There's a lot of coaching, there's a lot of training that needs to be done over the next few years. And I believe that if Canada is investing more and more and more on the international presence of artists, that we need to organize more and more workshops to help the artists to be ready to go on the international stage and all of that. So it's kind of an ongoing work that needs to be done. We are now discussing what will be the next strategic plan of the Canada Council. So starting in 2021 to 2026, we will have a huge strategy of engagement across Canada, and there will be questions around international to hear what artists right now need in order to be ready and confident and able to access the international stage. I believe that in a country like Canada, it's important to be connected to the world. And because we have so many artists who are also coming from very different regions of the world, we already have those incredible networks that we should scale up, that we should reinforce, that we should build on.
Okay, so last question. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you this, and it isn't necessarily completely within the cultural diplomacy framework, but it is a frustration that a lot of artists feel around the travel ban. We are happy they exist. However, the timelines upon which we hear back from them is not usually within the timelines that we are asked to come and do what we're asked to do. So how can this granting framework be more responsive and answer us quicker? Because a lot of times people leave on their trips without even knowing if they have Canada Council funding, and you can imagine the stress that engenders. So yeah, I wonder about, how you can convene a jury quicker, how we can get answers to people much quicker about their international trips.
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, I know that. I hear that all the time, and I know it's a huge challenge. And I think the challenge, it's very difficult because there are many demands we need to assess and all of that. We try, our goal is to give an answer within 10 weeks, which is in the Ottawa standards fast. It is not fast from the perspective of the artist, especially when you travel internationally and things are happening like that. So, and the answer to that, one of the issue we have right now is that travel grants. I mean, that's my view. Travel grants should not be centralized in Ottawa. It should be done by local arts council because they can move more quickly than we can. But the problem is that, frankly, right now in Canada, except in Quebec, international is not big enough on the agenda of many of the local funders. So we are now in this situation where something like travel grants, which is becomes very complex at the level of a huge country like Canada, is still quite centralized at Canada Council in Ottawa. I don't want to abandon that because it's a need, but I think that there's a difficulty attached to it, and the difficulty is the fact that we process. Even when we want to speed up the process, there are certain things that you need to do, and it takes some time. So the only thing I can do is that, the staff is very aware of that at council. We try to streamline, we try to be faster. We are a little bit faster now than we were last year. We may be a little bit faster next year, but there's a limit in terms of how fast we can do it at the level of the Canada Council. I think, more and more, obviously, for instance, when it's cultural diplomacy, it's a different story because it's not the regular programs and it goes faster. But through the regular programs, I don't have any choice. It's a competition. You need to compare things. You need to give a fair chance to everybody. And that is requiring a certain amount of time. It's difficult to compress. So we know the frustration. I mean, we are aware of that. We try to, compress it as much as we can. We are, again, better now than we were like 2 or 3 years ago. I think that maybe there will be eventually some solutions in terms of IT systems. I don't know, but I would lie if I would say, okay, no problem, it will be 2 weeks next year. I don't think we are there yet. The process of analyzing, reading, assessing, comparing, all that requires a certain amount of time. And so it's not ideal, to have that at Canada Council. Would be much better if it would be, if every jurisdiction would take care of that, because they are closer to the clients and all of that. But it's better to have it at Canada Council than not to have it at all. This is where we are.
Okay. All right. Well, that's it from me. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, and thank you for your patience with the
technology. It's fine. It's to be expected on some level. It's fine. But yeah, thank you so much and have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much for your questions. Thanks.
To find out more about Simon Brault and Sedina Fiati, check out massculture.ca. While you're there, join the growing MC network as a way of staying connected to cultural research. Goodbye.